Are evangelicals in America defined by what they believe, or would it be more accurate to say that they're functionally defined by who they've excluded? Well, that's kind of the controversial, provocative question at the heart of Isaac Sharp's book, The Other Evangelicals. Let me tell you what I thought about it. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I just finished reading through Isaac Sharp's book, The Other Evangelicals, published by Eerdman's. I'm going to take you through my response to this book as I summarize the main idea, the research behind it, the readability of it, and then my general reaction to it. So let's dig in. So the main idea of The Other Evangelicals is kind of a contrarian, maybe revisionist. I don't mean that in a derogatory way at all. It's just kind of a trying to revise the conventionally received historical account of the evangelicals in America over the past 150 years or so. So this is really an historical argument, an historical record that kind of cuts against the grain or pushes against the popular narrative of evangelicals. That popular narrative is that evangelicalism emerged in the early to mid 1900s as an alternative between the rigid and harsh fundamentalists and the kind of culturally capitulating modernists, so to speak. The narrative that's really been put forward and kind of conventionally received is that evangelicals were a third option, a middle way between those two extremes of fundamentalists and modernists. And Isaac Sharp is really trying to trouble and question that received narrative, to say that evangelicalism has not just been defined by a middle road between those two options, nor is it even primarily defined by what people say they believe, but it's actually been more functionally and accurately defined by the boundaries that have been put into place to exclude certain populations of people who tried to claim they label evangelical, who tried to say, yes, we're evangelicals just like you, but then they've been excluded over the decades to more and more clarify who evangelicals are. And so he's arguing that historically, and a historically kind of honest look at the situation would say that evangelicals really are very theologically conservative, generally white, politically conservative, anti-feminist, and anti-gay. That's kind of his 5 historical kind of pieces that he brings to play into this argument. So, and those definitions have been clarified by virtue of who the evangelical movement has excluded over those decades. That's kind of the main idea at the heart. That's kind of the thesis of the historical thesis of the book that he then unpacks chapter by chapter. So that's the main idea of the book. It's very provocative. It's very, very, very it's compelling in its provocativeness, I have to say. That argument, if you're listening to this, you might even be responding like, "Ooh, that sounds like kind of a hot potato." That'd be an interesting thing to read. And I got to say, this book really, really, really is interesting. Okay, let me get into a little bit more of the weeds here. Not too long, but the research behind it is. It might be helpful to wrap your mind around, in terms of the research, it'd be helpful to wrap your mind around the structure of the book a little bit. So each of those identities I just referred to, each of those kind of aspects of identity, the theologically liberal, politically progressive, feminist, so on and so forth, each of those has its own chapter. So it's a thematically organized historical study. It's somewhat chronological in that it starts in the late 1800s and then does move through, but it's more accurate to say it's kind of thematically organized. So the first chapter is on the theological liberals, leading into kind of the social gospel movement, for example. And then the next chapter is on how did black evangelicals kind of get excluded, particularly fast forwarding into the civil rights era, and then how did progressive evangelicals get excluded, and then how did feminist evangelicals get excluded, and then how did gay evangelicals get excluded. That's like the building argument. And the reason I'm saying that in the research section is because each thematic chapter digs into particularly writings and sermons and conference kind of materials as it relates to the theme of that chapter. So the chapter on black evangelicals, for example, he talks a lot about Tom Skinner's speech at 1970 Urbana, which I did know about before going into this book, but he also talks about William Pennell and his writings, his really, really provocative writings in the 60s and 70s. And there's more characters that go into in each chapter than that. But there's about each chapter has about 3-ish or maybe 4 historical kind of biography snapshots of individuals that kind of embodied each kind of identity. So Ron Sider and Jim Wallace in the progressive political camp, for example, Virginia Mollenkott and in the feminist, for example, and then there's In the liberal chapter, Theological Liberals, at the beginning is Harry Emerson Fosdick is one. So each chapter includes biographical snapshots of important key figures, and then a lot of info on their writings and their speeches and or sermons if they were pastors, for example. So it's really good. That's all to say. It's really, really good. It's very thorough. It's very careful. It's very compelling. And I think it's fairly represents the viewpoints as I can see it from each of those historical figures that are included. So that's a bit on the research behind it. It's very serious historical work. Now, the readability of it, man, I got sucked into this book. I couldn't put it down. That's for a lot of personal reasons, I have to say. But the reason I'm saying this in the readability section is because I was personally kind of primed. I'll say more about this why in my reaction. I was personally primed to like be intrigued by this book on lots of levels as it relates to my personal story and kind of my own experience in evangelicalism. But the readability aided and abetted my kind of sinking into this book. So what I'm trying to say is that it's academic and it's careful. It's not a breezy read in the sense of it's not conversational in style. It is more academic in style. It's more serious. However, importantly, what I'm trying to emphasize is that there was nothing in the readability that hampered my enthusiastic interest in getting through the book. I just wanted to keep going, page after page after page. I wanted to keep getting it. When I would flip to the next chapter, when I got to the chapter on Black evangelicals, I just thought, oh my gosh, I really want to know what he's going to say about this. When I got to the chapter on the feminist evangelicals, I thought, I really want to know what he's going to say about this. I had names that floated around in my head as it related to all these categories, and so I just kept wanting to see how they were going to come to play. Jim Wallace had a big impact on me, for example, and I wanted to see how is he going to figure into the progressive chapter. And so the readability just aided my natural interest. So if you're someone like me who has a really a lot of experience in evangelicalism in America and has done a good bit of reading on the history of that movement, this is bringing a lot of scholarly heft, and it's written in a way that's only going to just kind of increase your interest, I think. But it does not lapse back into an overly simplistic reading on anything, and it is longer, and it is serious, and it is academically rooted. So take that all into account. But for me, as someone who reads a lot of books, I found the readability dialed in really well, really, really well, and I just ripped into this book. I loved it. Okay, so that's a bit on the readability. Now, my reaction to this book, maybe overly enthusiastic reaction, I don't know. I really adored this book, and it was published in 2023, and it's like jumping up into my list of favorite books of the year, absolutely. And I want to articulate a little bit of why, because admittedly a lot of it is my personal experience and some of my personal reflections. I had a deeply personal reaction to this book, actually. And what I mean by that is as I've alluded to on this channel before, and some of you have even asked, like, I'd like to hear, I've alluded to my personal spiritual journey, and some of you have asked, I'd like to hear more about that. I'm working on a video series going into some of that. So know that I have noted that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how it relates to my experience of this book, because I grew up in very conservative evangelicalism. I grew up in the evangelicalism that is basically up and down the line defined by this book, which is to say theologically conservative, politically conservative, largely white, opposed to feminism, and opposed to anything LGBT kind of related. That is what I grew up in. I was really formed by it. And over the years, especially going into college, going through grad school, I have just found myself increasingly in a troubled and tortured relationship with that kind of religious tradition. On a lot of levels. It'd be too much to go into it in this review. It would take us too far afield, but it does relate to this book, because I felt myself I've had a lot of struggles, honestly, processing all of that. I've had a lot of struggles sorting out what was really good about my upbringing, what are hard things that I kind of have had to unpack, what are areas in which I've changed my mind on with things as it relates to social realities, political realities, theological realities, scriptural reality, like interpreting scripture, all of that stuff I've had to do, and I'm still doing a lot of work to sort that stuff out. And I'm going into all of that to say that I resonated at such a deep emotional level with this book, because I'll give a couple examples. in the chapter on how theological liberals were excluded from the evangelical camp, he talks a lot about the doctrine of inerrancy. And I had a specific, very pointed struggle with coming to terms with what I think about that doctrine in my own life. And I found myself, again, this is a personal example, I found myself afraid to be honest about what I thought about the doctrine of inerrancy in a lot of evangelical spaces. And in fact, in my years, especially in parachurch ministry, I've been confronted by multiple pastors who didn't really know me very well, multiple ministry leaders who have confronted me and tried to pin me down on the inerrancy issue as a way to vet whether or not they would be able to support my ministry work to college students. For example, this is really what happened to me. And so I'm reading this chapter on theological liberals and reading about how all these historical figures 100 years and more years ago went through the exact same thing and experienced a marginalization, a sidelining, and exclusion from the evangelical community because they didn't toe the line on inerrancy, even though they said, I believe all of the pillars of evangelical belief that you are saying you were saying that you require to be considered evangelical, even though I believe all those things, and I have a nuanced understanding of inerrancy. Just that is enough to exclude these figures, according to Isaac Sharp's argument. I experienced all of that. And so I'm reading that chapter and thinking, oh my gosh, there is 120-year historical precedent for specifically what I went through. And so I had this profound, like I don't know, emotional attachment to some of the arguments in this book. And then that went very similarly. I'm more, in some ways, I'm more left of center, more progressive with certain political issues. And that, Jim Wallace was an interesting figure in kind of my own journey and processing some what I thought about like policy issues and whatnot. And so same exact emotional experience in reading that chapter. I've had a lot of rethinking about kind of the ways I've inherited certain understandings of race and the racial history of America and how that plays into my evangelical upbringing and why I never met or really like interacted with any black Christians growing up, or anybody that would call themselves a black evangelical. I never had that experience growing up. And then so I go through this, and I worked for InterVarsity for years. And so then the story of Tom Skinner's Urbana talk is like lore in InterVarsity world. And then that's played into my whole kind of reckoning with what's the role that evangelicalism has played in kind of excluding black pastors and black ministry leaders and just black Christians in general, even though statistically a ton of black Christians in America are very theologically conservative and hold to a lot of the pillars of what we would consider to be evangelicalism. So I could this would go way too long if I dive way too deeply into all that. I'm just trying to emphasize and speak honestly about some of my story because it relates so directly to this historical argument. And as I was reading it, I'll try to wrap this review up now. As I was reading it, I just kept having these like lights go off in my mind of like, oh my gosh, this is the precedent for the experience that I had. This is the precedent for why my community looks this way. This is the precedent for why certain people have felt, in my view, have felt marginalized, why voices have been sidelined. And importantly, this is really, really important because I think at the end of the day, I think Isaac Sharp's thesis I think it's right. I think he is right to say that functionally, pragmatically, practically, sociologically, whatever, evangelicalism has been, the definition of who is an evangelical has been clarified over the years precisely by who has been excluded. And it's kind of dishonest to hold, and this is where I'm coming to, it's kind of dishonest to say, well, evangelicals just hold to the Bebington Quadrilateral. They hold to the Lausanne, Congress article. It's a little bit dishonest to say that when in reality, people who can say, well, I am an evangelical, but I believe in progressive politics, or not sure that I line up, toe the line on inerrancy. If those people get excluded for those reasons, then evangelicalism really isn't just the Bebington Quadrilateral. It really is the Bebington Quadrilateral plus these other things. And that's kind of what Isaac Sharp's argument really, really, really lands on, is that there's a long history here that should kind of be clear by now that evangelicalism really means these other requirements. It's not merely these theological beliefs, much as publications like Christianity Today, etc., will try to defend that and still uphold that notion, which has been put forward historically by people like George Marsden and whatnot. It's just more honest to say, like, there are other requirements when it comes to being an evangelical in America. There are other requirements beyond just a couple of these theological, ecclesiological, soteriological claims. There's a lot more going on when it comes to politics and gender and race, especially. And I have to say, like, that's something that kind of was bubbling inside me, and I was thinking, like, I was feeling like maybe that was really, really true. Before I read this book, and this book just kind of, it was like that when you're at the when you're at the optometrist and that lens clicks in, and it's like you can see it clearly. Like, wow, okay, I feel like I can see some things clearly now. So there you go. There's quite a bit more of a personal journey on this review than most of my reviews get into. But I couldn't avoid talking about that because that's how my personal story is so entangled in my response to this book. I'm actually intrigued by, I might try to reach out to Isaac Sharp and see if I can do a conversation with him and unpack some more of my reactions to it. I might ultimately land, even where I'm at today, I might ultimately land on some more conservative or conservative adjacent places than he does when it comes to his own journey through all this stuff. I don't know him. I would love to talk to him about that, but at the end of the day, I just resonated so powerfully with his historical argument and found him to be essentially correct in his diagnosis, and very, very persuasive in the data he plays out, that I just really absolutely love this book. It's actually going to probably become an important book for me as it relates to my own process of understanding who I am and where I fit in the evangelical landscape and the religious landscape in America more broadly. So there you go. There was my very personal reaction to a book that I absolutely love, The Other Evangelicals by Isaac B. Sharp. Thanks as always for taking some time to watch.